Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today we're talking about graph databases. So I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and I'm joined today by Charlie Beveridge from Tiger Graph. Hi Charlie.
Hi Andy, great to be here.
Yeah, well, nice to have you, and making her Big Data London webinar debut today. So that's all very nice. We were talking earlier, actually. It's actually the 50th Big Data London webinar. So congratulations to everybody who's made it this far. I hope you enjoyed today's. So this session, as always, is designed to be interactive. Please ask any questions you have in the question box at the bottom of your screen. I'll endeavour to ask Charlie as many as I can at the end of the session. If you lose your stream at all, you shouldn't, but if you do, just hit refresh in your browser and you'll jump straight back in. However, without further ado, I'd like to throw it over to our featured presenter today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Andy. Hi, everyone. So my name is Charlie Beveridge. I have spent the last 7 years at Accenture helping our clients solve really hard problems with disruptive tech. And disruptive, in terms of the disruptive tech that I've been working with, graph databases really is one of the ones that I've been seeing drive the greatest progress. And I'm here today to talk, as Andy said, specifically about entity resolution. It's kind of an introduction to entity resolution, and we'll talk about why graph databases are so good at it, and also hopefully I'll explain how important it is for a business to get right. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right, so first I will cover off what entity resolution actually is, and we'll see that essentially it enables what we call a golden thread. We'll look at why it's so hard to do, how a graph does it so well, and then what is possible to achieve as a business once you've cracked it. So what is entity resolution? Let's start with the entity resolution that we all do on a day-to-day basis. Let's say you receive this email from PayPal. How do you know that it's actually from PayPal? Every time we receive an email fishing for our financial information, we look for indicators that the email is or is not from the same trusted entity that we know. It might be a suspicious from address or different formatting or design. It might be typos or an unusual signature. If all of those were the same as the usual characteristics of your PayPal emails, you'd probably come to the conclusion it wasn't a phishing email and PayPal was in fact the sender. But if something looks off, you'd start to think it was from someone else. Or in other words, you're evaluating two potential sending entities, PayPal and a potential scam sender, and you're deciding, based on a set of indicators, whether or not they're the same PayPal sender. Or another example, can you tell if these two cars are the same actual car? Normally we can tell the difference between two identical cars because they each have a unique number plate. But in these photos, we can't see the number plates. So what else do we look for? Color, shape, model, all looks the same. But there could be millions of cars with those attributes. So what else can we find? Perhaps a particular dent or scratch that's unlikely to be the same on any other car. Something as unique as possible, because the more unique the indicator, the more certain we can be that it's the same car. Or even better, two dents or a dent and a scratch, because the more indicators they share, the more certain we'll be that they're the same. So the process of deciding whether two entities are the same or not is called entity resolution. And we've just been performing entity resolution naturally on email senders and these Kia cars. But it's not just us as consumers who are performing entity resolution on a day-to-day basis. We as consumers are the entities that companies perform entity resolution on in order to run their businesses too. Have you ever wondered whether Netflix would allow you to share your login details with a friend? And that question presents itself to Netflix as, are these two people logging into Netflix on the same user account actually the same person? It's within Netflix's interest to reduce the number of users sharing their logins, given that it directly impacts their revenue. But how can they work out who each person is and whether they're the same person or not if they're all using the same username and password. They have to look for other indicators, just like you did with that email and that car. For example, they might assess IP address, device ID, or time and date of login to come to a conclusion on whether the users are the same or not. Or another consumer example is, have you ever wondered whether if someone steals your credit card, your bank will figure it out for you? And for your bank, the question is this transaction being made by the same person as usual? It's within both yours and your bank's interest to identify and block payment fraud before it goes through. But how can your bank work out whether it's you that's made the payment for each and every transaction? Again, they must use groups of other indicators. For example, they could use merchant type, time or day of spend, location of spend, delivery address, size and frequency of spend, to come to a conclusion on whether a particular transaction was made by you or not. So we're seeing that performing entity resolution involves determining a set of indicators that, when grouped together, can paint a picture that allows us to conclude with enough confidence that two things are the same. And let's just think about that for a moment. What we're doing is essentially using a probability calculation in the absence of a unique ID. A unique ID, like a car number plate, tells us in black or white terms whether something is the same or not. But without one, we turn to groups of other indicators that together create a probability that we can use. So far, these have been very relatable examples because we come across them in day-to-day life. But how does this concept apply in more complex B2B scenarios? Many important day-to-day business decisions involve the need to confirm whether something is the same as something else. And most commonly, it's about determining whether a customer contact is the same person engaging across multiple functions in the business. But it can also be many other types of entities that need resolution. For example, another would be product or account. So let's consider some B2B examples. This lady organises her company's monthly office plant subscription. And over the last few months, their policy has changed from real plants to artificial plants. So she's worked with the plant company's provisioning and customer service teams to ensure her subscription is updated. She's meeting the plant company's sales rep later to discuss the renewal of her annual subscription. And she expects that sales rep to understand their change in policy. And she hopes that he might come with ideas on the best product options for her next subscription. That sales rep needs to arrive with the knowledge that since he originally sold this contract for real plants, the company has changed their requirements to artificial plants. He needs to be armed with information from across provisioning and customer service in order to have the right conversation. In other words, there needs to be a golden thread of customer information available to that salesperson. Or in more technical terms, entity resolution needs to be performed on that customer across all the functions and systems they've been processed through since the original sale. And if there's no unique ID for that customer across the plant company's business, then we know that groups of indicators can help create a level of certainty that two different entities in two different systems are actually the same customer. The company might use indicators such as name, email address, physical address, company, mobile number to create a golden thread of information for that customer. Or here's another common B2B example. When a business receives a new order, they might need to ask, is this the same company that placed an order 6 months ago and still hasn't paid their bill? How do you protect yourself as a business from customers who don't pay on time or ever for your products? You need your go-to-market functions to be cautious when making offers to or closing sales with anyone from these accounts or their subsidiaries. You need to prepare your service and success teams to have the right conversation with the right customer as well. But that all involves creating that golden thread of customer information between billing, payments, sales, marketing, and service. So again, we'd be performing entity resolution to create that golden thread. We'll come back to this one later and we'll deep dive on how groups of indicators could work for us in this scenario, like looking at company name and address and contact name, email, and number. And a final example. How can a company know that this caller into customer service is entitled to a specific service level based on what the caller's employer has bought for its employees? The company has to work out a few things on this one. And again, we'll deep dive on it later. But at a high level, it involves performing entity resolution on contacts, accounts, and products all at once in order to create golden threads from sales through to service, so that service are equipped with all the right information to provide what is expected. Now, clearly, when entity resolution isn't done at all, we see all of the problems of not doing it, like fraudulent use of Netflix accounts or companies not knowing which product you bought. But it can also go wrong in the other direction, i.e., if the entity resolution calculation is too sensitive and it thinks incorrectly that two things that are actually the same are in fact different entities. Only last week, for example, my bank blocked my card for a second time this month because I was ordering something to a delivery address that didn't match my billing address, meaning they thought someone else was using my card, and both times caused a few painful hours waiting to hold music. So why is it so hard for companies to get this right? The thing is, entity resolution is a really hard problem to solve. It's not impossible, but it's hard enough to be a blocker when companies can just about get by without it. So many companies actually don't attempt entity resolution, and those that do struggle to do it properly end to end. What you get is this. Each function of a company runs itself in a way that optimizes for their own incentives and objectives, which generally are specific to their function. They'll choose processes and tools that support what they need to do to be successful within their own constraints. Marketing do what they need to do to market. They'll purchase lists of potential targets, they'll maintain GDPR subscription preferences, and they'll choose a campaign management tool like Marketo to run their campaigns. Sales do what they need to do to sell. They'll create contacts and accounts for the conversations that are most likely to convert into closed-won opportunities, and they'll choose to use a platform like Salesforce to do this. Customer service do what they need to do to serve. They'll create caller contacts for any inbound queries, and they'll try to resolve queries as quickly as possible. And they'll have chosen tools like ServiceNow for this sort of case management. Finance, provisioning, and all other functions have their own processes and tools too. And in the case of growth through acquisition, there'll likely be more than one of these processes and tools in each and every function. And there's limited reason for sales to ensure they capture activity against marketing contacts upstream, or for service to capture inbound query information against sales contacts upstream, and so on. The conversations take place in a function silo, and the information is captured by that function's process and tool, and generally it stops there. And then one day, finance raises their hand and says, well, why didn't we catch this customer for not paying their bills for the last 5 months? And then you've got marketing saying, well, that's not one of our qualified leads, and sales saying, well, sales doesn't own the customer after closing the sale, and service saying, well, they never asked for help with any billing issues. Does that sound familiar? And are there other instances you can think of where a siloed operating model creates a problem for your business? What we've just outlined is a disconnected environment that a lot, if not most, companies find themselves in. And it's entirely understandable because, in reality, functions are operable like that. There may be cracks in the system and revenue leakage and cost duplication and inefficiency, but the business still runs, and each function can achieve its function-specific objectives, so why change? The key here is that what is good for the function isn't always good for the company. Achieving a sales target by selling to bad debt customers isn't going to do the company's top line much good. In the scenario of the customer not paying their bill, think about how the firm could have instead operated if customer data points had been connected end-to-end into a golden thread. Service could intercept a customer there and then about not paying their bill and offer to help or to advise. Sales could ensure the customer is appropriately credit checked at renewal, or that they're sold a cheaper product instead. Finance might even start working on creating more customer-friendly billing options if they could see the ultimate impact on revenue. Your whole operation starts to achieve company-consistent objectives. So company objectives require a much more holistically aligned operation. And it's only in doing entity resolution correctly, i.e. creating those golden threads, that every function can be held accountable for representing the whole company in the day-to-day way that it operates. Now, bad debt customers are just one example of where golden threads become important, but there are many more. Is your marketing budget being spent in a way that is truly optimizing closed-won sales? Is your customer service operation capitalizing on every upsell, cross-sell opportunity in front of them? Is your product organization empowered with knowledge of which customers experience which problems or need which enhancements in which product? And as an exec, you want to assess performance of your overall business as accurately as possible to make better strategic decisions. You'd want to have a collective grasp of what your whole business is doing at once, and not a set of siloed perspectives which your brain must make sense of by pulling into some sort of coherent narrative. So what is it about graph databases that addresses this problem and enables this connected end-to-end view? Let's first look at the traditional way of doing things, because that's where most companies are today. Most modern databases are made up of table after table of data, stored logically, accessible rapidly, scalable infinitely. The latest wave of cloud-based data lakes have a very compelling proposition: experience no limits and only pay for what you use. So they've been incredibly successful, and rightly so. But the key part is that these technologies are designed to store data points and not data relationships. And when it comes to entity resolution, we need to use data that's joined together into relationships, because we're trying to understand how to relate clues from all over the business into an overall golden thread for a particular entity. Like, for example, a thread for that same customer who isn't paying their bill on time. Now, if you have unique IDs, like a customer ID, in all of your tables, it's easy to do a lookup to join the tables together, in the same way you use a number plate to match two cars quickly. But if you don't have that unique ID, and you're instead looking for a group of indicators that together bring you to your confidence threshold that it's the same customer in each system, then it's a different story. Let's consider the example of the customer that hasn't paid their bill. And we want to ensure that sales don't let them renew their contract, and also that marketing pause on any offers they're sending to that customer. So payments raise the issue that the customer hasn't paid, and they only have a name and an email address. Variants of that name exist in sales, service, billing, and marketing tools. Robert, Bob, Rob, Evans with an S, Evan without an S. And that exact email address also exists in billing and service. So at this point, we're pretty confident that we've got the same customer at least across payments, service, and billing, right? But what we're looking for is the ability to identify this customer in sales and marketing tools, so that those functions can pause their planned activity for that customer. Now we've found some other customer information in service as well, an office phone number and a physical address. And we can see that that same physical address exists in sales too, along with the second phone number. With the information we have so far, can we assume that the customer in the sales system is the same customer who hasn't paid their bill as flagged by payments? Do we have enough identifiers to reach our match confidence threshold and tell sales not to renew with that customer? Probably not quite yet. The name Robert Evans doesn't match any other tool exactly, and our only exact match is an address, and we're not certain whether that's a shared or common address of some sort, so it'd be good to have another indicator. Okay, we also find a nickname known to sales, Bob, which matches the name information in both the service and billing tools. How's your confidence level now? Let's say we're confident enough to flag to sales that they shouldn't renew for now. How about marketing? Can we tell them who to stop sending offers to? All we've got is another address, which has no match across the other tools, and the name is very different too. How about now that we found they're holding the same customer mobile number as sales? Are we more confident now it's the same person? So whilst payments only had an email address and one version of a name, we can now connect the dots back to sales and marketing through different information like a physical address, nickname, and mobile number. We're using a network of information as a group of indicators to create that golden thread. In other words, we're performing entity resolution using indirect connections. So now we can ensure that sales don't let this customer renew, and also that marketing pause on any offers they're sending, with a sufficient degree of confidence that they'll be targeting the right customer. And crucially, we saw that as the information available grew over time, we were able to adapt to the conclusion we were making. Graphs hold an organic view of the connected context, and each data point added to the graph gradually evolves the overall knowledge it provides. So thinking back to the way companies' data models are set up today, It's not about finding a simple ID match from one table to another and to the next. It's about looking at directly and indirectly connected chains of information holistically. Information which could be stored across a huge number of tables in many different formats, and determining whether altogether it's good enough to come to a conclusion or not that this customer or entity is the same. And it's exactly that process of connecting and grouping identifiers that makes graphs so powerful for entity resolution. The key takeaway is graph's real power comes in when you need to make use of multiple layers of data attributes to understand connections indirectly in order to come to a conclusion. And you can imagine that the more connected contacts you have in your graph, the better decisions you can make. And for those of you thinking how messy my slide was, this is a real graph, and it's no simpler. But it's clear that the complexity of the network that a graph can map is exactly what makes it so powerful. And another very important aspect of graph is its power in running entity resolution on 2 or more different entity types at the same time, which is pretty useful given that there are more than one entity types in many complex golden thread scenarios, and actually almost all B2B scenarios. The example we just talked through with the customer who didn't pay on time looked at creating that golden thread for that customer contact, from payments through to sales and marketing. But in order to truly get a grip on this problem, we would have had to create a golden thread for that contact's company itself too, as well as the products it had bought, using the same sort of grouped attributes and indirect connections method. Let's also consider the other B2B example. How can a company know that this caller into customer service is entitled to a specific service level based on what the caller's employer has bought for its employees? This involves multiple golden threads too. Let's think about it. First, we've got the caller in. Do we know who they are and have we seen them before? We'll need to perform entity resolution to pull together a view of what we know about this caller to ensure they don't need to restate a load of details we already have on them, like who they work for, and also to ensure we pick back up on any previous unclosed conversation. That's entity resolution on the contact. Next, we're hearing their issue, but how do we ensure we're gearing up to provide the service level they're entitled to? They're the end user of a B2B customer. So they're not the person who bought the product, but they work for a company which has another employee or set of employees who did buy it. There are a few steps in this. Do we know which company our caller is from? And if they're part of one company, say a UK-based company, do we know whether that's the same company we're working with elsewhere in the business, or is it a subsidiary of a holding company? And are there any other subsidiaries? We care about this because, in theory, any of these accounts could have purchased the relevant product and service level from us. That's entity resolution on accounts. Once we know the company structure, do we know which accounts bought which products? Each function has a slightly different view of what products you sell. Marketing has a customer-facing top-level view. Provisioning has a delivery-centric, detailed SKU-level view. Finance has an internal cost-centric view. Which one matters in this context, and how do we tie it back to this account and contact? That's entity resolution on products. Now we found the products this caller's company purchased, which ones are currently within contract and which come with specific service levels contractually agreed. This may or may not involve entity resolution on the contract terms, depending on how simply they're stored, but you get the sense. We need to ensure a golden thread of contractual information between legal, sales, and service. So with these golden threads, service can know that this caller is entitled to a specific service level, given what service level and product their employer has purchased. And what's more, in this scenario, that service level needs to be calculated in an instant, the moment the caller dials in. And unless there's a rapid way of understanding that complex cross-functional web of indirect connections to perform all the necessary entity resolution, the customer experience is damaged. And what I find most fascinating is that the same graph can do entity resolution on all of these things all at the same time. And in lots of cases, having all that context there even means there are indicators in one circle that help with entity resolution in another circle and vice versa. And so the effectiveness of the graph really snowballs the more you build it out. So what can a business achieve with golden threads in place? we've started to get a sense of the types of things that golden threads enable. And critically, it's all about elevating to operate as a business and not just as a set of functions. We've seen how Graph helps us draw conclusions using implicitly connected networks of information that take us to a confidence threshold in the absence of a unique ID for a simple lookup. And we've also seen how the concept of entity resolution applies across a spectrum of scenario complexities. So how far does Graph enable us to go? What are the sort of things that a business can achieve with all of its complex golden threads in place? The ultimate outcome of this at the exec level is the ability to understand, control, and take advantage of all of the risk and opportunity within the business. Consider questions like, if I change this part of my product, how many customers will be affected if something goes right or wrong? Think about golden threads of products, product subcomponents, customer, and end users you need to understand that. What proportion of my build revenue is dependent on this one third-party supplier? Think about the golden thread of suppliers, products, and customers. You need to understand that. What size and where is the white space we could target to maximize our revenue through acquisition or upsell, cross-sell? You'd need golden threads across products and customers, as well as across potential new customers and even potential new products in order to understand that. So we start to see that as an exec, with Graph underpinning the data in your business, you can assess the overall performance and potential of the business, and you can make much more astute strategic decisions. So let's recap. A business needs to operate as a whole business and not just a set of functions to create the maximum value for itself, or effectively to turn risks into opportunities. In order to operate for the business, as opposed to in a silo, each function must be empowered to see things holistically. And this requires golden threads of data across front and back office processes and tools. Because typically unique IDs aren't available for simple lookups, golden threads require entity resolution, which uses groups of indicators, both directly and indirectly connected, to conclude that two entities are the same, so long as there are enough connections to reach confidence. And finally, Graph is naturally positioned to relate together groups of attributes into very easily navigable networks. They'll enable you to create golden threads that update organically as you obtain more information, and they always reflect the latest collective knowledge of your business. Thank you so much for listening. I think we've got some time left now for Q&A. Otherwise, please feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn if there's anything you'd like to talk about. And I just wanted to let you know that the Tiger Graph and AI Summit will be where I'm speaking in the next couple of weeks. And so please do register for free via the link there.
Thank you very much, Charlie. For anyone who's interested in seeing Charlie at the Tiger Graph Summit, there's an attachments button on the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen there. And I'll do my own plug there as well for Big Data London, which is coming back in September in person, we hope, in Olympia. So there's a link to both of those things in that attachment section, along with some other resources from Tiger Graph. So thanks very much, Charlie. Thanks very much for your presentation. So we've got a couple of questions in. Please do carry on sending them in. I've got a couple of questions for you as well on the back of your presentation. First, we'll keep it really nice and general. There was lots of good business cases there. What happens if people just don't buy into this kind of thing? What happens to the kind of companies who try and do this without Graph, who aren't looking at golden threads, who carry on as normal? What are the dangers for those people?
Good question, Andy. So I think, the dangers are the perspective that you have on the data that you're using is siloed. Essentially, you can't see. It's kind of like if you think about a function that's looking at a customer journey, it's kind of like just looking at the touch point, at one specific touch point, and not actually looking at the holistic journey and the way that that customer is operating. And so you're likely to misinterpret. You've only got half a perspective from what that customer's really trying to do. You're likely to misinterpret what it is that they're doing, and therefore the cost of whatever you're doing is going to waste, or it's not as effective as it could be if you're not actually pulling together everything you should.
Perfect. Well, the other thing that obviously noticed with graph analytics and some of the examples you gave, actually not all of them, but some of them, they always seem to involve companies like Amazon and Netflix and LinkedIn and people like this, people who I guess the majority of people who don't work for them would see as companies way ahead in this kind of fields. Are you seeing any smaller businesses jumping on this, or perhaps what people might classify as less technical businesses, I suppose, and what's in it for them? The smaller guys and the guys who perhaps are near the bottom or not quite as data mature as some of these kind of tech giants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are lots of small businesses that are actually building propositions using graph in the background, but that aren't necessarily, marketing themselves as graph databases. And so they're kind of taking advantage of what graph can do, but they're not being open about that. So, and what instead they're doing is kind of building an interface on top of it that is targeted at a very specific use case. So there are definitely lots of kind of smaller companies that are taking advantage of this. More generically, though, TigerGraph has a kind of free community edition with no limitations on features. And so there are also lots of opportunities for even startups to be kind of downloading this kind of tech and playing with it and starting to see the benefits. At the time you sort of start to grow into a larger business, you can buy the larger product. But the barrier to entry is very low.
Perfect. Well, actually, following up to that sort of barrier to entry, we've had a question in. I was wondering about this kind of thing as well, but it's actually been worded quite nicely. I was going to ask about the sort of people that you need kind of thing, but this person's gone very specifically into is it preferable? Is it absolutely necessary to have data scientists on hand to get the most amount of value from graph, or is a team of analysts sufficient? I mean, what's your opinion on that? I guess you could go one of either way.
You can go one of either. It's a great question, and it's a question that we hear a lot. So different people can do different things with the tool. TigerGraph specifically comes preloaded with algorithms that you can run at the press of a button, which means that you don't need to be able to code to run the tool. I can't code and I can run the tool. I can load data, I can run algorithms, and I can see the outputs. That said, if you do have data scientists or people that want to learn the graph query language, which for TigerGraph is GSQL, and do much more kind of custom or complex algorithms, then the option is there too within the same Graph Studio interface. So you can go one of two ways. Some people choose to use the outputs of a graph to go into a visualization tool that is a strategic part of the business architecture already. So if you've got reporting that you want your execs to be looking at, you can have data analysts using graph without code, and then that feeding visualization tools that more business-minded folk would use. But if you want to get more complex and you want to really customize your algorithms, you need to be able to write GSQL, which, as the name says, is very similar to SQL, so it's super easy to pick up.
Okay, perfect. In terms of explaining this at exec level, like you said, it's one thing getting the output of it and putting in front of execs in a shiny visualization. I imagine that's very effective and something that lots of people do. Whilst I think you did a really interesting job of explaining, what the graph databases do in those contexts with Netflix and earlier on in the presentation. A lot of the time, people are charged with explaining technology in a way to senior people in order to get investment. So What would be a good way, a simple way to explain to the boss why they need to invest in this kind of technology, for example?
There is no other technology that so natively connects all of your data together, and that means that without your data connected, you can't get the kinds of insights that you can get if you do connect it. In fact, if you think about the way our human brains operate, we understand things through connect. If we learn a new concept, we're more likely to understand it if we can connect it to a concept that we already exist. The connections actually oftentimes are more important than the data points themselves if you want to draw real insight from your data. And so with Tiger Graph, you're able to load any data in there. There's no limit to the volume of data. There's no limit to the number of connections. And there's also no limit to the number of connections within your specific query that you want to ask. And so that kind of the power and the sophistication of the insight and the analytics you can run, you can't get that from anything else. And your whole business starts to look completely different.
Yeah, perfect. And do people need to be database literate? Do they need to be data literate? Do they people say data driven? Do they need a coherent kind of data policy or data culture going through the business to get this started? Is that or is it something you can just kind of jump into for people? It's a very similar question has just come in about that. So yes.
Okay. So I'd actually answer the question in two ways. I think you can use Graph to make your data more coherent in some ways. So where you might be able to store any data in any format in your strategic data lake, you might have just sort of bunged it in there to store it. If you can actually process some of that data through a graph, you can start to get insight out of that becomes data in itself. So, and that starts to kind of connect it together into context. So there's one aspect of Graph that actually allows you to create more structure in the data that you already have. The other way I'd answer the question is you always want structure in your data. So Graph is you can't just load, unstructured documents into Graph. It is for structured data. It's just going to put more connections and structure into it. And in the way that you govern your data, it's very important. So you want to be able to the kind of consistency in the meaning of your data types, and what data types are used for what, and why we care about certain data types or not. That's all held in your Graph schema, and that level of governance is super important, because when you ask a question of your data, without that consistency, you're not going to get a consistent answer.
Yeah. We've got a question here about non-business applications, which is interesting. But I was going to ask a similar question. So it mentions the fact that the NHS is a big user of Graph technology, which is fantastic. Another use case for this kind of technology in healthcare. I was going to ask, what sort of other applications of Graph technology do you think are coming up in the future? Obviously, we had a little look at sort of that Netflix fraud prevention and maybe recommendation kind of thing. Is there anything that's happening now which is interesting, or perhaps you could see in the years coming up that Graph may be used for business or non-business, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've talked about entity resolution today. That's kind of what you have to do to start when you first use a Graph and load your data in. Once you've got your entities represented in there and all connected together into the context, that's when you can start to do some really interesting, insightful, algorithmic stuff on top of that data. So when you start with, as you're saying, Andy, Netflix uses Graph to do recommendations, category-based or lookalike customer type based. In healthcare, it's the same thing. You can use Graph to determine that a particular patient, once you've performed entity resolution, you've got all the data about that particular patient all there in the context. You can determine, okay, well, is this patient experiencing similar symptoms, or do they have similar traits or health concerns as this other patient? And if they do, then what did that other patient do to get better? And so you can, that kind of lookalike analysis, you can start to give next best treatment options. And Tiger Graph is doing work in this space, actually, with some of the largest health providers in the US as well.
Perfect. I think we will probably leave it there, actually, Charlie. There's been lots of questions. We'll make sure that you get answers to those. So thank you for sending those in. Someone, either Charlie or someone from Tigergraph will get in contact with some of your more specific Tigergraph and platform questions. So don't worry too much about that. It's been a pleasure to have you on, Charlie. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Good luck with the summit coming up in April. And remember the links before you leave, everybody, on the bottom right-hand side, anyone who hasn't checked those out. Yes, enjoy the rest of your Easter holidays, everybody. And we will be coming back live at you in a couple of weeks, I believe. Okay. So thanks, guys. Thank you, Charlie. See you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.